In 1502, Niccolò Machiavelli, the man whose ideas still make kings tremble, entered a room to meet Cesare Borgia. He expected arguments, diplomacy, perhaps threats. Instead, he encountered silence. Borgia did not explain his motives. He did not justify his crimes, and he did not seek the approval of the man observing him. In that frozen stillness, Machiavelli understood something few men ever do. Speech is often the last refuge of the weak. While you spend energy trying to prove your worth, explaining your intentions, begging to be understood, you signal to the world that you are harmless. True power does not shout. It bends gravity around itself until others have no choice but to orbit its presence. We live in an age of desperate exposure, where excessive transparency has made people predictable, and the predictable is disposable. Today, the architecture of your submission ends. There is a fundamental law of existence that is rarely taught. Value is not an intrinsic property of who you are. It is a perception created by the difficulty of possessing you. The air you breathe is vital, yet you do not admire it because it is abundant. You have become oxygen in the lives of others, useful, present, guaranteed, and therefore invisible. The architecture of desire begins the moment you stop being a public resource and become a rare event. Cesare Borgia never revealed the full picture. He offered fragments, suspended sentences, silences held just a second too long. The human brain despises the unfinished. This is known as the Zeigarnik effect. What remains incomplete occupies the mind. If you want others to think about you, do not give them answers, give them questions they cannot escape. Begging is biological suicide. Those who beg for attention confess they cannot obtain it through merit. A king does not ask for respect. He lives in such a way that disrespect becomes a fatal miscalculation. Power is born from the willingness to walk alone. That which is easy to obtain is impossible to value. When you are easy to reach, easy to please, easy to convince, you become disposable. There is a final level. Not using silence, but becoming silence. The man who does not need to be understood cannot be controlled. He does not explain, he executes. He does not react, he decides. The silence of need sounds like abandonment. The silence of sovereignty sounds like authority.
But there is something that happens after silence becomes natural, after you no longer feel the urge to fill space, after restraint stops feeling like effort. At this stage, power is no longer something you perform. It becomes something you inhabit. Most people believe mastery is about control over others. This is a primitive misunderstanding. Control is external. Mastery is internal. The sovereign man does not dominate environments. He stabilizes them. In parapsychology, we describe this as field coherence. When internal alignment is complete, the nervous system emits consistency, and consistency creates gravity. People often describe this sensation incorrectly. They say someone has presence, What they are actually perceiving is internal unity, no contradiction between thought, emotion, and action. Fragmented individuals leak energy. Integrated individuals compress it. Compression creates density. Density creates authority. This is why words lose importance at higher levels of power. Language is needed when coherence is absent. Silence is sufficient when coherence is total. At this point, something unsettling occurs. You stop needing outcomes, not because you no longer desire results, but because your identity is no longer attached to them. This detachment is frequently misunderstood as apathy. It is not. It is sovereignty. When outcome dependency dissolves, fear loses its leverage. Fear only exists when identity is negotiable, when you believe something external can define you. The sovereign mind is non-negotiable, and therefore unthreatenable. This is why true strategists appear calm under pressure. Pressure requires internal instability to function. Without instability, pressure collapses. Chaos does not overpower order. It exhausts itself against it. Observe history carefully. The most dangerous individuals were never the loudest. They were the quietest. Not because they lacked emotion, but because emotion no longer ruled them. At this level, emotional stimuli are processed, not absorbed. Insults lose velocity. Praise loses seduction. Approval and rejection become informational, not identity-defining. This is the death of psychological leverage, and with it dies the final chain. Most people never reach this stage, not because it is complex, but because it is lonely. The crowd offers comfort. Sovereignty demands separation. There is a moment when silence stops being a strategy and becomes a condition. At this stage, you are no longer doing anything differently. You are no longer available in the same way. Most people believe availability is generosity. It is not. Availability is exposure, and exposure is permission. When you remove availability, you remove permission. Permission to interrupt you, permission to demand explanations, permission to negotiate your boundaries. This is when control mechanisms fail. Most social systems rely on reaction loops: stimulus, response, correction. This one, silence, breaks the loop. Without reaction, the system cannot calibrate, and without calibration, it loses power. This is why silence feels threatening to insecure environments. They cannot read you. Unreadable individuals are uncontrollable individuals. Control requires prediction. Prediction requires patterns. Silence removes patterns. At this level, you become illegible. In parapsychology, we call this cognitive opacity, a state where external observers cannot model your internal decision process. This is extremely rare, because most people are desperate to be understood. Understanding feels like safety, but understanding is exposure, and exposure is vulnerability. The sovereign individual abandons the need to be understood and accepts the cost. That cost is misinterpretation, being misunderstood. Most people fear this. They fear being seen incorrectly. They fear losing narrative control.
The sovereign man lets the narrative collapse. He does not correct assumptions. He does not chase clarification. He allows projections to exist, because projections reveal more about the observer than about him. This creates an asymmetric informational advantage. You see others clearly. They see themselves in you. That is power. This was understood by ancient initiatory orders. They did not explain doctrine to outsiders. They allowed mystery to filter the unworthy. Confusion was not a flaw. It was a gate. At this level, confusion protects sovereignty. Those who demand clarity are rarely prepared for truth. They want comfort. Sovereignty is not comfortable. It is stable, and stability intimidates chaos. Most people live in constant internal negotiation. They debate themselves endlessly. They override their own decisions. This creates internal noise. Noise leaks. Others sense it. That is why people test boundaries. They feel inconsistency. But with internal silence, there is nothing to test. The sovereign individual does not threaten. Threats imply negotiation. He simply exists within limits, limits that are not announced, but enforced, quietly. This is where fear transforms, not fear of punishment, but fear of misalignment. People fear crossing someone they cannot read, because consequences are unknown. Unknown consequences halt impulsive behavior. This is why silence stabilizes environments faster than authority. Authority demands obedience. Silence creates caution. Caution is deeper than obedience. Obedience ends when surveillance ends. Caution persists. At this stage, something else shifts. Time perception. You stop rushing. Not because you have less to do, but because urgency no longer controls you. Urgency is a form of fear, fear of loss. The sovereign mind has already accepted loss. When loss is accepted, speed becomes optional. This is why powerful individuals appear slow. They are not delayed. They are unpressured. Pressure only works when something inside you resists. When nothing resists, pressure dissolves. At the deepest level, sovereignty is subtraction, not accumulation. You remove dependence. You remove urgency. You remove explanation. What remains is essence. Essence cannot be negotiated. It cannot be rushed. It simply is. This is the final silence. Not emptiness, but total internal agreement. And when a man reaches total internal agreement, the world has no leverage left, because nothing outside him can pull what is no longer exposed.